The evening sun dipped low over the prairie, throwing long shadows across the dust road that led to the ranch. A small wagon jolted along, carrying a young woman with trembling hands folded in her lap. Her dress was plain, patched in places, and her face pale from the weight of what had just happened. She had not been the one promised. It was her older sister who was supposed to be wed to the widower rancher. But at the last moment, her family decided it was she who would be sent. They said her sister was too beautiful, too fragile, too necessary at home. She, on the other hand, was replaceable. So without protest, she was placed into the wagon and told to do her duty. Her heart thundered as the ranch came into sight: sturdy fences, a weathered barn, and a house standing like a sentinel of solitude. He was waiting at the gate, tall and broad-shouldered, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He had lost his wife 2 winters ago, and grief had carved lines into his face. He had not asked for love, only for someone to help raise his little girl and keep the house warm. When she stepped down from the wagon, his brows furrowed. He knew this wasn't the woman promised. The disappointment flickered across his features, quick and sharp. He opened his mouth to speak, but before any words could leave, a tiny figure burst from behind his legs. A little girl, no more than 6, with dark braids and curious eyes, clutched at his hand and looked up at the new woman with wonder. The girl's lips parted, and in a soft, certain voice she whispered, "God sent you after all." The words fell like water on parched ground. The young woman's knees nearly gave beneath her as the sting of rejection softened in an instant. The rancher stiffened, as if unsure whether to correct his daughter or let the words stand. But the child's certainty was unshakable, her eyes wide and shining as though she had seen something her father could not. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and loneliness. The woman, still unsure of her place, set down her small satchel. She expected him to send her back, to demand the family honor their original promise. But as the evening stretched on, something began to shift. The little girl followed her everywhere, slipping her hand into hers, tugging her toward the hearth, and insisting she sit at the table beside them. At supper, the silence was heavy, but the child filled it with chatter. She asked about her new mama, about the ribbons she wore, about the songs she might know. And though the woman's throat tightened with every question, she answered with as much warmth as she could muster. The rancher said little, only watched with guarded eyes, his hands resting on the table as though to anchor himself. Days turned into weeks. The young woman rose before dawn to help with the chores, her hands blistered from scrubbing and carrying, her muscles aching from labor she had never done before. The rancher observed her from a distance, silently weighing her worth. She felt the weight of his judgment every time their paths crossed, yet he never sent her away. Perhaps it was because his daughter clung to her so fiercely, as though she had been waiting for this very woman all her life. The girl would slip into her lap at night and whisper prayers, thanking God for sending the right one. And each time, the woman's chest ached with both gratitude and sorrow, for she had never been anyone's first choice, not even here. Yet in the child's eyes, she was chosen. One evening, as the sky blazed orange, the rancher finally spoke. They were out by the barn, repairing a broken fence. His voice was low, rough as gravel. "You weren't the one they promised." Her hands froze on the wooden beam. She swallowed hard, the truth pressing heavy on her tongue. "No, they sent me instead. My sister was better suited," they said. Silence stretched between them. He studied her, his jaw tight. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I thought I'd been cheated. Thought God turned his back when they brought you instead." Her heart clenched. She braced for rejection. But his eyes lifted to the house, where the little girl's laughter spilled through the open window. A softness entered his expression, a crack in the stone. "But she believes you're an answer to prayer." His gaze returned to hers, steady, unyielding. "And I'm starting to wonder if maybe she's right." Her breath caught, tears pricking her eyes. She looked away, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to be what you need. You're here," he said simply. "Sometimes that's enough." And so the days went on, no longer as strangers, but as people learning to bind their wounds together. He began to see not just the one sent in another's place, but the woman who stayed, who worked with quiet determination, who held his daughter as though she were her own. She began to see not just the hard, weathered man she feared, but the father whose heart still bled for his child. In the silence of the plains, something tender took root between them. Not chosen, not planned, but perhaps, as the little girl believed, sent. The nights were long on the prairie, filled with the sound of coyotes yipping across the wide darkness and the sigh of wind through the cottonwoods. She often lay awake, staring at the rough beams of the ceiling, wondering what fate had done to her. She had not been chosen, yet here she was, in a stranger's home, living a life she had never asked for. Still, every time the little girl tiptoed into her room and crawled under the quilt, whispering soft prayers of gratitude, the woman's heart softened. Perhaps she was meant to be here. Perhaps her life was not an accident, even if her family had treated her like one. The rancher kept his distance. He worked from dawn to dusk, mending fences, branding cattle, riding the range with the quiet stoicism of a man who had buried too much inside. Sometimes she caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his eyes unreadable, his jaw set. At first, she thought it was disapproval, but as time went on, she began to wonder if it was something else, hesitation, maybe, or fear of letting another person close. The little girl, Emma, was the bridge between them. Every day she drew them together, insisting her father sit at the table while the woman taught her to stitch, begging both of them to listen as she recited verses she had memorized, tugging their hands so they all prayed together at night. She was the one who bound the household into something resembling a family. And though the woman often felt like an intruder, Emma's love was fierce and unwavering, enough to keep her anchored. One morning, when the frost still clung to the windows and the fire had burned low, Emma burst into her room, clutching a wooden doll missing one arm. "Can you fix her?" she asked, her eyes wide with the kind of trust that expected miracles. The woman smiled faintly, taking the broken doll in her hands. "I'll try." She rummaged through her sewing things, piecing together fabric and scraps of wood until the doll had a new, crooked arm stitched in place. When she handed it back, Emma hugged her fiercely, whispering, "See, Papa. She fixes broken things." The rancher, standing silently in the doorway, looked at the scene with something heavy in his eyes. He turned away without a word, but the woman's cheeks warmed under his gaze. As the weeks rolled into months, small shifts began to take place. She learned how to milk the cow without spilling half the bucket, how to mend harness leather with strong, even stitches, how to cook bread that didn't turn into heavy lumps of stone. She made mistakes, plenty of them, but instead of scolding her, the rancher started to show her, his hands steady as he guided hers, his voice low and calm. He wasn't a man of many words, but she began to read the patience in his silences, the gentleness in the way he slowed his pace so she could keep up. Winter was cruel that year. A storm swept down from the mountains, burying the ranch in snow so deep the fences vanished, the world turned into a sea of white. The three of them were shut inside the house for days, huddled near the fire. The roof creaked under the weight, the wind howled like a living thing, and food had to be stretched carefully. It was during those days that something began to change between them. One night, when the fire had burned low and Emma had fallen asleep curled against her side, the rancher sat across from her, his elbows on his knees, staring into the flames. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. "I never asked for love. I only asked for help." Her throat tightened. She nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. "But sometimes," he continued, his eyes lifting to hers, "life gives you what you didn't ask for because it's what you needed." Her breath caught, her fingers tightening on the quilt. She wanted to ask him what he meant, if he was talking about her, but fear held her tongue. Instead, she only looked back at him, and in that silence something unspoken passed between them, something neither of them dared to name. When spring came, the snow melted into rushing streams and the land woke with green again. The ranch needed mending after the long freeze. Together they worked side by side, repairing broken fences, clearing debris, tending to the cattle weakened by the harsh winter. She grew stronger, her hands calloused, her back firm with labor. He noticed, though he never said much, only the occasional grunt of approval or the faintest of nods when she managed something she'd once fumbled. One evening, while gathering firewood, she slipped on a patch of mud and cut her palm on a sharp rock. Blood welled, and she winced, trying to wrap her apron around it. He appeared almost instantly, taking her hand firmly, his brow furrowed as he examined the wound. Without a word, he led her inside, washed the cut carefully, and bound it with strips of clean cloth. His touch was steady, yet gentle, and for the first time she dared to meet his eyes up close. There was no coldness there, no disappointment. Only a quiet intensity that made her heart stammer. "You don't always have to prove yourself," he said softly, tying the bandage tight. Tears threatened, and she blinked them away quickly. I want to be enough. You are, he said simply. Then he let go of her hand and turned away, as though the words had escaped without his permission. Summer brought trials of its own. A sickness swept through the cattle, threatening to ruin the herd. Long nights were spent nursing calves, mixing remedies, and praying for survival. She worked beside him every step, refusing to yield even when exhaustion weighed her down. And through it all, Emma's laughter was a light that carried them, her small hands always reaching for theirs, reminding them of what bound them together. One hot afternoon, after days of endless labor, the rancher collapsed against the fence, sweat streaming down his face. She hurried to his side, pressing a damp cloth to his brow. For a moment, their closeness startled them both, the awareness of how their lives had entwined without either of them asking for it. "You're stronger than I ever thought," he murmured, almost to himself. Her lips trembled into the faintest of smiles. "I had no choice." He turned his head then, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that left her breathless. "Maybe none of us did." The words lingered between them, heavy with meaning. She wanted to ask if he regretted it all, if he still thought of her as the sister who was sent in another's place. But before she could, Emma's voice rang out, calling them for supper, and the moment broke. As the seasons turned, the bond between them deepened, slow and steady like roots pushing into the earth. There were no grand declarations, no fiery romance, only the quiet certainty of two souls finding each other in the midst of brokenness. Sometimes he would linger at the table after supper, watching her laugh with Emma, his eyes softening in a way he never let her see. Sometimes she would catch herself humming while she worked, realizing too late that she felt, for the first time in her life, like she belonged. One night, as autumn leaves rustled against the window, Emma climbed into her lap and asked the question neither of them had dared to face. "Mama," she whispered, "will you stay forever?" The woman froze, her heart pounding. She glanced at the rancher, who stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then, slowly, he crossed the room, his hand resting on his daughter's shoulder. "Yes," he said quietly, his gaze locking with hers. "She will." And in that moment, the woman who had been sent in another's place finally understood, she had been chosen after all. The harvest moon rose high above the wide prairie, painting the land in silver light. The ranch lay quiet, the fences mended, the barn doors latched, the herd settled in the fields. The woman stood on the porch with her shawl pulled close, listening to the night. Somewhere in the house behind her, Emma was already asleep, tucked in with the doll she had once stitched back together. From the open window came the sound of her gentle breathing, steady and sure, as if peace itself had taken root in her small chest. The rancher stepped outside, boots heavy on the wooden boards, and came to stand beside her. For a long while, neither of them spoke. They had grown accustomed to this, the silence between them no longer sharp with unease, but soft, like a quilt laid over weary shoulders. "You've been here a year now," he said at last, his voice low and rough. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "A year. Does it feel like it?" She thought about it, about how the first weeks had dragged like a heavy yoke, about how the sting of being sent in her sister's place had gnawed at her, about the way she had braced for rejection every time he looked at her. And then she thought about the laughter at the table, the lessons in the barn, the way Emma had slipped her hand into hers and prayed for her every night. Slowly, she shook her head. "It feels like longer. Like I've always been here." His hand tightened around the porch rail. "I thought I was cheated when they sent you instead." The words struck her chest, sharp as ever, but before the ache could take hold, he turned to her, his face softened by the pale glow of moonlight. "But I was wrong. God knew better than I did." Her breath caught. For so long she had lived with the shadow of being the second choice, the replacement, the one her family had cast off. Yet here was this man, saying she was not an accident, not a burden to be endured. Her throat thickened, and tears blurred the stars above. "I never thought I could be enough for anyone," she whispered. He reached for her then, his hand covering hers, warm and steady. "You've been more than enough. For me. For her. For this home." For a moment, she could not speak. The wind rustled the cottonwoods, the crickets sang, and the night wrapped around them like a blessing. And then, finally, she found her voice, soft and trembling. "Then I'll stay. Not because I was sent, not because I was chosen for duty, but because I choose it now. I choose you." I choose her. I choose this life. His grip tightened, and though words were scarce for him, the look in his eyes said what he could not, that he had chosen her too, long before he admitted it to himself. When they went inside, Emma stirred and mumbled in her sleep. The woman brushed back her hair and kissed her forehead, whispering a promise that this home would always be hers, that she would never again know loss like before. Emma sighed in contentment, her little hand curling around the woman's sleeve. In the months that followed, the certainty of belonging grew. Neighbors who had once whispered about the strange arrangement came to see the quiet strength of their family. They saw the way Emma blossomed under the woman's care, how the ranch thrived with her steady hands and the rancher's firm guidance. They saw, too, how the two of them, once strangers bound only by circumstance, had become partners in every sense. The woman no longer thought of herself as the sister sent instead. That identity fell away like a shed skin, replaced by the truth she carried now: she was the one who had been meant all along. Every scar, every rejection, every night of loneliness had been leading her to this place, this home, this family. She no longer saw herself through the eyes of those who dismissed her. She saw herself through Emma's eyes, through the rancher's, through God's, chosen, needed, beloved. There were still hardships, of course. The land was not easy, nor was life. Storms came, cattle sickened, fences broke. But none of it carried the same weight it once had, because she no longer bore it alone. Together they faced each trial, their hands and hearts joined in quiet strength. One evening, years later, Emma, older now, her braids longer, her steps surer, sat on the porch with her, watching the same harvest moon rise. She leaned against her and whispered, "I always knew. I always knew God sent you." The woman smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "And he sent me the two of you." Emma wrapped her arms around her, and the rancher, standing nearby, placed his hand gently on her shoulder. In that moment, under the wide sky, she realized she had never been a replacement. She had always been a blessing, though it had taken time for her to see it. The wind carried the scent of earth and grass, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, the hum of a life built not from duty, but from love. And as she leaned into the warmth of her family, she whispered a prayer of her own, not of asking, but of gratitude. For being sent, for being chosen, for finally belonging. And under that vast, unending sky, she knew her story had not been one of chance at all, but of providence. She had not been the bride intended, but she had been the bride destined.